Hello out there, you wonderful people. This is Andre, the Game Idea Guy. Thank you once again for lending me your time and your ear listening into another Gamer's Thoughts discussion. And question. Did 4K really make massive improvements to gaming? Like, was it worth the effort to try to push most of the industry to jump to that standard of resolution when it really doesn't add much to the games? Because let's be honest, HDR could be done at 1080p, ray tracing could be done at 1080p, DLSS could be done at 1080p. All these other things that can be added to enhance the visual experience of a game can all still be done at 1080p. So why do we need to jump to 4K or 3160p? Why do we need to do that? What makes this a vast improvement? Because there are so many ways to clean up textures and make them look better without pushing that higher level resolution. And things that won't cost as much or tax the hardware as much for these games to be made. That's something I wonder if people think about. And on top of that, the resources that now go into development for games to be run at 4K could be put into making better physics engines, making the AI in your games smarter, improving the environments, adding in better characters, more dialogue, more music. There's so much stuff that could be added to a game that could improve it well beyond going with the resolution bump. And it's not a small resolution bump. It's huge. And on top of that, that also means that it makes everything more expensive, vastly more expensive than it was before. Which also, making that jump to 4K also means that frame rates will be lower most of the time. And so many people complain about games running at 30 FPS. But everybody wants to push for 4K, which means that you would have to have a rebound down to those lower frame rates until games can actually be sped up and development time and resources are used more properly. I mean, it also doesn't help that a lot of developers don't clean up their code and don't remove unneeded assets from their games, which bloat the size of them massively. So, on top of the resolution bump jacking up the size, on top of the code not being cleaned up and that keeping the size larger than it should be, and on top of resources and assets and things being left in games that don't need to be in them, which also adds to the size, and having now to follow buzzwords that people still don't understand themselves, but just think it's the next best thing when it comes to technology. There were more efficient, cheaper ways to develop all of these platforms and to develop these consoles that would have been more beneficial in the long term, and it wouldn't potentially price out developers or companies from making their own games unless they're a large production house, which that shouldn't always have to be the case. It's a situation very similar to how things went when Microsoft and Sony pushed HD, where we lost a lot of our middleware development studios and houses simply because they couldn't keep up with the resources and the cost of the resources that were needed, which is disheartening for people that were fans of a lot of those mid-tier developers. And many of them died out because they were trying to chase Sony and Microsoft, and on top of that, abandoning Nintendo in the same hand when Nintendo had the cheaper priced platform to develop for. And I think that's Nintendo's general thing, is they're trying to keep most of their costs low when it comes down to their hardware. Now, you can say, hey, maybe it's a little too pricey. That's an opinion. Like, yeah, I could agree that maybe some of their stuff could be cheaper, but hey, they're looking at their profit margins. I don't know what their profit margins are like. I can't make an argument for or against it. They're just working within what they know is profitable for them. But they still keep their hardware manageable when it comes down to cost. Again, we didn't need to make the rush and jump to these higher resolutions. The problem was that it kept being promised because it was the next big buzzword that could draw a lot of attention. And people not really knowing much about these buzzwords just jumped on and held on for the ride. Even if that meant that there were a lot of games that came out disappointing them because they were just poorly developed and didn't have the time put into fixing many of the issues that the games ended up having before they launched, which ends up leading us down the road to all of these day one patches, all of these updates that just boost and increase the size of a game because, again, instead of cleaning up the code and removing the stuff that's not needed, a lot of companies will just leave stuff in. Stuff that has no business being in the game because it may be unrelated or, honestly, it's just useless leftover textures and stuff that they may have just not decided to use. So, yeah, 4K is not beneficial to game. HD wasn't really beneficial to 7th gen. It would have actually been more beneficial to 8th generation. I think that, honestly, too many companies are jumping the gun and running too fast to try to have the next big thing. That's the big problem with the situation. Had Sony and Microsoft during 7th gen come out with consoles that weren't touted as 1080p machines and were just, okay, we'll do 540p. That'll be our target. Like, yeah, we want to increase the resolution because we want our games to look better, but that'll be our target. HD TVs weren't really a big thing at that time anyway. So whether or not Nintendo themselves feels like they made the wrong move with the Wii and not making it an HD console, I think they did make the right choice in that particular instance. You can't predict how the market's going to go. You can't push. You could push it a particular direction, but you can't predict if that direction is going to work. Had the Xbox 360 and the PS3 been 540p machines, one, they probably wouldn't have had as many issues with their games if their target was 540p. But the problem with that is that the original Xbox could run resolutions up to 1080p. I don't think a whole lot of people actually know that. So for Microsoft, they couldn't go backwards. And Sony, trying to keep up with the Joneses, had to meet them there. Nintendo said, hey, we're going to do our own thing and try to make more interesting gameplay scenarios. which I think, again, was the right choice. But if they had done 540p as the next resolution for game consoles, and then for 7th gen, and then moved up to 1080p for 8th gen, probably would see a lot more developers that we used to know still being around. Probably still have a Midway. Probably still have original G.I.G. Probably would still have Acclaim and several other developers, because a lot of them died out during the 7th generation. Potentially you could still have a lot of them around, because their development costs would have been down, would have been easier to get their games out on these platforms, and it still would have benefited HD televisions. 960 by 540p is still a resolution that would have benefited HD televisions. It would have still been better than 480p. It's the same way I say that we should go with game consoles should have been going with 1440p for this generation rather than 3160. But I'm probably the one that would be considered crazy talking that way. But like, no. They should have gone for the prettiest stuff that they could do. Go for the higher tier graphics and everything, even if the consoles aren't efficient enough to really truly run these games like this on a constant basis. No, they need to do it. I'm of the thought process, less can be more, as long as you've got the creativity to use it. I mean, otherwise Breath of the Wild would not be as popular of a game as it is. That's something to consider. But I think I've rambled long enough on this subject, and I would love to hear from people on points they agree with and disagree with. So on Anchor, if you're listening, go ahead and record a voice message if you have some points you contend with. Your messages can only be about 60 seconds, I think. And on YouTube, leave a comment. Otherwise, thank you guys very much for listening. Keep your eyes and ears out for more stuff from me. And until the next time, enjoy your games and peace out, everybody.